I want you to think about the specific kind of trust you extend to strangers in shared spaces simply because those spaces have rules. A gym membership, a badge scan, a locker you pay a small monthly fee to have access to. You assume, without ever really examining the assumption, that everyone else in that space has been filtered through the same basic process you were, and that the filtering itself means something about who they are. I want to tell you about the 6 weeks it took me to understand exactly what that peace and predictability had actually been concealing. I want to say, before I go any further, that I am not someone naturally prone to suspicion. I have never been the kind of person who assumes the worst about strangers, who reads menace into ordinary, unremarkable behavior simply because it happens at an unusual hour or in an unfamiliar context. I mention this because I think it matters for understanding just how long it took me to take seriously something that, in retrospect, I probably should have flagged considerably sooner than I did. I want you to picture that locker room the way I still can, clearly, months later. The specific cold of the tile floor in the earliest minutes of the morning, before enough bodies had passed through to warm the air at all. The particular smell of industrial cleaner layered over the ghost of the previous evening's sweat, never quite fully aired out by the time the doors unlocked again at 4:30. The sound, or rather the specific absence of sound, that exists in a large building at that hour. No music yet, no chatter, just the occasional metallic clang of a locker door, the hum of overhead fluorescence, the soft rush of a shower running somewhere out of sight. It is a particular kind of silence, institutional and slightly hollow, the sound of a space built for far more people than are currently using it. I had built an entire private ritual around that silence over 2 years without ever quite realizing I'd done it. The same locker, second row from the door, third from the end. The same 15 minutes of quiet before the gym floor opened, spent lacing shoes, adjusting earbuds, doing the small mental transition from half asleep to ready. I trusted that room the way you trust a room you have occupied hundreds of times without incident, not actively, not consciously, but in the deep, unexamined way that becomes almost indistinguishable from the room itself. I first noticed him, though noticed feels like too strong a word for how little attention I actually paid him at the time, sometime in early autumn on an ordinary Tuesday morning that felt, in every other respect, exactly like the hundreds of Tuesday mornings before it. He was sitting on the bench in the far corner of the locker room, near the last row of lockers, a section slightly separated from the main changing area by a support pillar that broke up the sight lines just enough to make that corner feel a little more private, a little less trafficked than the rest of the room. He was dressed in ordinary workout clothes, shorts, a plain t-shirt, athletic shoes, nothing that stood out as unusual in a locker room full of people dressed almost identically. What I registered in that first brief glance was simply that he was sitting there, phone in his lap, not doing much of anything. I assumed, the way you assume things about strangers you have no reason to think twice about, that he was scrolling something on his phone, taking a break between exercises, or simply running late and gathering himself before heading out to the gym floor. None of that registered as unusual. Locker rooms are full of people pausing, checking phones, tying shoes, doing the small, unremarkable business of transitioning from street clothes into workout mode and back again. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, the specific quality of stillness I noticed about him that first morning, because it is a detail I did not consciously register as meaningful until considerably later, once I had enough additional data points to look back and recognize it. He was not scrolling. His thumb was not moving across the screen. He was simply sitting there, phone held loosely, gaze not quite fixed on the screen and not quite fixed on anything else in the room either, The specific, unfocused stillness of someone whose attention is somewhere other than where their body physically is. I finished changing, headed out to the gym floor, and did not think about him again for the rest of that day. I want to be honest that even describing this now, I feel a small retrospective embarrassment at how completely unremarkable that first encounter felt in the moment. There was nothing about him, on the surface, that separated him meaningfully from the other dozen strangers I passed through that locker room without a second thought every single week. He was neither large nor small, neither notably young nor old, dressed in the same generic athletic wear that half the gym seemed to own in some slight variation. If you had asked me that same afternoon to describe his face in any real detail, I don't think I could have managed it with any real confidence. He had achieved, whether by accident or by design, the specific kind of unremarkable presence that allows a person to occupy a shared space for months without anyone ever having a specific reason to ask what he was actually there for.
I saw him again the following week, in that same corner, in what I recognized with a small jolt of surprise in almost exactly the same posture. Seated, phone in lap, that same unfocused stillness I had noted and then forgotten the week before. I remember thinking, in the mildly curious way you think about small workplace or gym oddities that don't yet bother you enough to investigate, that he must simply be someone else's early morning regular the way I was, someone whose schedule happened to overlap with mine 2 mornings a week rather than 5. Over the following several weeks, that overlap became considerably more consistent than twice a week. I began seeing him nearly every single morning I came in, always in that same corner, always in some version of that same seated stillness, phone in his lap, gaze unfocused. I do not believe, looking back honestly at my own memory of those weeks, that I ever once saw him actually use any of the gym equipment on the floor. I never saw him lift a weight, never saw him on a treadmill, never encountered him anywhere in the actual workout space that the rest of us were paying our membership fees to access. I want to be honest about how gradually this realization built, because I think that gradual quality is actually the most important part of this story. It did not strike me all at once as strange that a man was coming to a gym every single morning and apparently never working out. It accumulated, morning by morning, glance by glance, a slow, almost imperceptible layering of small observations that individually meant nothing, and that I did not consciously assemble into a coherent pattern until considerably later than I probably should have. I mentioned him, eventually, to another regular I'd become friendly with over those 2 years, a man named Curtis who worked construction and kept a similar early schedule to mine. Curtis laughed in a way that suggested he'd been noticing the same thing and simply hadn't found it worth mentioning either. "Weird guy in the corner," he said. "Never seen him actually work out. Figured he's just killing time before something else." We joked about it briefly, the way you joke about small oddities that don't yet carry any real weight, speculating idly that maybe he had a wife who worked out at that hour and he was simply waiting to drive her home. Maybe he was between jobs and the gym was just somewhere warm and quiet to sit before his day properly started. Maybe he had some private ritual of his own that had nothing to do with any of us and everything to do with whatever was happening inside his own head. I want to emphasize how genuinely unthreatening those explanations felt at the time. We were not 2 men quietly suspecting a predator in our midst. We were 2 men mildly amused by a local eccentric, the kind every regular gathering of strangers eventually produces. I kept noticing him anyway, in the specific way you keep noticing something you've decided isn't worth worrying about, my eyes drifting toward that corner out of habit more than concern each time I entered. Always the same seat, always that same faint, unfocused stillness. I began to notice small variations, too, that I did not think much of at the time, but that I would later understand mattered considerably. The way his gaze would occasionally drift toward the main bank of lockers rather than staying fixed on his phone. The way he seemed to time his own arrivals and departures loosely around the flow of other members rather than any workout schedule of his own. The morning everything shifted for me happened almost by accident, the way I imagine most of these realizations do. I had forgotten something in my car, my earbuds specifically, and jogged back out to the parking lot mid-routine to retrieve them, re-entering the locker room from an angle I did not normally approach it from, coming around the support pillar that usually blocked my direct sight line to that corner bench. From that angle, for just a moment, before he noticed me and adjusted, I caught him holding his phone up, not toward his own lap the way I had always assumed, but angled outward, toward the row of lockers along the wall, the specific angle and framing of someone taking a photograph rather than simply checking a screen. He lowered it the instant he registered my presence, the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had done exactly this many times before. I did not say anything to him directly. I gathered my earbuds and left, my mind already working through the specific unease of what I had just witnessed, turning that single ambiguous photograph over and over, trying to understand what possible purpose it could serve. I want to describe what the rest of that particular workout felt like, because it was unlike any I'd had at that gym in 2 years. I moved through my routine mechanically, barely present in my own body, my mind circling back again and again to that brief, undarted glimpse, the angle of his phone, the specific smoothness with which he lowered it, the careful neutrality of his expression as he waited for me to leave. I found myself replaying every previous morning I'd seen him in that corner, wondering with a growing unease I couldn't fully articulate how many other mornings that same gesture had occurred exactly like that, unnoticed, simply because I had never once approached from that particular angle before. By the time I finished my workout and headed back to the locker room to shower, he was gone, his corner of the bench empty in a way that felt somehow more unsettling than his presence had. I found myself scanning the row of lockers he'd been angled toward, trying to guess whose might have been in frame, feeling a specific creeping paranoia I did not fully understand yet, and would not fully understand for several more weeks. I told Curtis about it the next morning, in a lowered voice near our own lockers, glancing instinctively toward that now empty corner as I spoke. Curtis's easy amusement from our earlier conversation had faded into something more serious by the time I finished describing what I'd seen. "That's not nothing," he said quietly. "You should probably say something to the front desk." I remember agreeing with him in the moment, and then, in the way these things so often go, letting the intention slip through the ordinary busyness of the following days without ever actually following through on it.
3 weeks after that parking lot incident, I came home from my morning workout to find my own front door standing open, a pane of glass beside the doorknob shattered inward across my entryway floor. I want to describe the specific disorienting quality of that moment because it is unlike almost anything else I have experienced. Your own home is supposed to be the one space in your life that exists entirely outside the realm of things you need to actively monitor for danger. Finding it violated, standing there in your own driveway, staring at your own broken window, produces a very particular kind of vertigo, the sense that the single safest, most reliably yours space in your entire life has just been proven not to be either of those things. The burglary itself, once police arrived and I walked through the house with them, turned out to be relatively targeted. A laptop, some jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, A small amount of cash I kept in a drawer for emergencies, and strangely, my spare car key, which I kept in a bowl by the door and had not thought about in months. Nothing else in the house had been disturbed, no other rooms ransacked, no other drawers searched. The specific efficiency of someone who had apparently known exactly what they wanted and exactly where to look for it. The responding officer noted, almost in passing, that the burglary had occurred sometime between roughly 5 and 6:30 that morning, based on a neighbor's doorbell camera catching a brief, unclear glimpse of someone approaching my house around 5:40. I remember standing there in my own entryway, glass crunching faintly under my shoes, doing math I did not want to do. That window overlapped almost exactly with my own gym routine, the specific hour I was reliably, predictably away from my house 5 mornings a week. I want to describe what it felt like standing in my own kitchen an hour later, coffee going cold on the counter, running through the specific, unwelcome arithmetic that was beginning to assemble itself in my head. My gym schedule was not a secret. I had never once tried to conceal it, never had reason to. I posted about it occasionally, mentioned it to coworkers, wore the same gym's branded gear often enough that anyone paying even passing attention would know exactly where I spent my early mornings, and, by extension, exactly when my house sat empty. I thought about the man in the corner for the first time that day with something considerably sharper than mild curiosity. I thought about his phone, angled toward that row of lockers, and I thought, with a cold, creeping unease I could not immediately dismiss, about whether any of those lockers had ever been mine. I did not yet have any concrete reason to connect him directly to what had happened to my house. I only had a feeling, distinct and insistent, that the two things belonged in the same sentence, even before I had any evidence to actually place them there. I sat with my broken window boarded temporarily with a garbage bag and packing tape, staring at my own front walkway, feeling for the first time in 2 years of gym membership that the space I had trusted so completely might have been quietly working against me the entire time, in ways I had simply never had reason to imagine. I did not immediately connect my burglary to the man in the locker room corner. I want to be honest about that, because I think the gap between those two events is actually an important part of this story. It was Curtis, of all people, who made the connection for me, calling a few days after my burglary to ask if I'd heard anything, and mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that another regular at our gym had also been burglarized recently, during a similarly early morning window. That detail sat with me for the rest of that day in a way I could not shake. I called the detective handling my case, a woman named Officer Reyes, and told her about the man in the corner, about the photograph I'd caught him taking, about Curtis's mention of another gym regular experiencing a similar burglary. I remember feeling faintly embarrassed relaying it, worried it would sound exactly the kind of unfounded, anxious speculation I had always prided myself on not engaging in. Reyes did not treat it as unfounded. She asked several specific follow-up questions: what time the other regular typically worked out, whether his burglary had also occurred during that specific window, whether either of us had ever spoken directly to the man in question or knew anything about him beyond his presence in that corner. I did not have satisfying answers to most of those questions, but the pattern itself, once she laid it out plainly, felt considerably less like coincidence than it had a few days earlier. She explained that burglars occasionally exploit exactly this kind of predictable absence: gym schedules, work commutes, any reliable window during which a specific person's home would be empty, and that gathering information on multiple potential targets from a single shared location, like a gym locker room, would be an unusually efficient way to build a target list, provided the person doing the gathering had some way of connecting a face in a locker room to an actual home address. Reyes asked me, carefully, whether I had ever left anything with my name or address visible in that locker room, a gym bag with a monogram, a piece of mail accidentally tucked into a jacket pocket, anything that might have given a patient, observant stranger enough of a thread to pull on. I sat with that question longer than I wanted to, running back through 2 years of small, unremarkable habits I had never once considered a security risk. I did, in fact, keep a small luggage tag on my gym bag with my name printed on it, a habit left over from years of business travel that I had simply never thought to remove once that bag became my everyday gym duffel instead. I felt a very specific sinking recognition, telling her that detail out loud, understanding for the first time exactly how small and ordinary the gap in my own caution had actually been. She told me before ending that call that she wanted to speak with Curtis as well, and asked whether I knew the name of the other regular whose burglary he'd mentioned. I did not, but I promised to find out, and spent the rest of that evening texting back and forth with Curtis, piecing together a name, a rough timeline, enough scattered detail to hand over to Reyes the following morning. I remember feeling, for the first time since my own burglary, something closer to purposeful action than helpless anxiety, the specific, steadying relief of finally doing something rather than simply absorbing what had already happened to me. The investigation, once it gathered enough momentum to justify a warrant, identified the man from gym membership records. And once his phone was recovered following his arrest roughly 10 days later, revealed exactly what he had been doing in that corner for months. His phone contained dozens of photographs, taken exactly the way I had glimpsed him taking mine, angled discreetly toward rows of lockers, capturing name tags some members left visible on gym bags or jacket zippers, capturing glimpses of car key fobs left briefly unattended on benches, capturing, in several instances, actual combination locks mid-use, their owners unaware that someone nearby was documenting the exact sequence of numbers they'd just entered. He had cross-referenced names captured from gym bags and jackets against public records and social media to identify home addresses, using gym schedules observed directly, morning after morning, week after week, to establish reliable windows during which those specific homes would sit empty. Investigators found a working list of 11 names total, cross-referenced with addresses, of which 4, including my own, had already been burglarized by the time of his arrest. Detective Reyes explained during one of our follow-up conversations that this specific method, treating a gym locker room as a low-effort surveillance environment, given how much incidental personal information people casually reveal in a space they've been conditioned to feel safe in, was not something her department had encountered often, but was, in her words, distressingly logical once you actually thought through how much unguarded information passes through a space like that on any given morning. I asked her directly how he had actually connected the names captured on gym bags and lockers to specific home addresses, a step that had genuinely puzzled me since the moment Curtis and I first pieced together our shared suspicion. She explained that a combination of public record searches, social media cross-referencing, and, in at least 2 documented cases, simply following a car home on a morning he judged them unlikely to notice, had been sufficient. It required no particular technical sophistication, she said, just patience and a specific willingness to spend months building a picture most people would never think anyone had reason to build at all. She also told me something that unsettled me more than almost any other detail in the entire case. He had, according to his own phone's photo timestamps, been coming to that gym for nearly 5 months before my own burglary occurred, meaning the entire target list, the full 11 names, had been assembled slowly, deliberately, over a period considerably longer than the 6 weeks I had personally spent noticing him. My own awareness of him, as gradual as it had felt to me, had actually arrived relatively late in a process that had been quietly unfolding for most of a year. I sat with that specific detail for a long time after she told me. 5 months of mornings, 5 months of that same seated stillness, that same unfocused gaze, moving invisibly among dozens of us who trusted the space enough never to seriously question what he was actually doing there.
8. The gym, once the story became public through local news coverage of the arrest, added signage reminding members to keep personal information out of visible reach in the locker room, and increased camera coverage in that specific corner and several others where sightlines had previously been broken up by support pillars and locker rows. I still work out at that same gym at that same early hour because the actual root of what happened was never the space itself, but rather a specific person exploiting an ordinary space's ordinary blind spots. I am, I will admit, considerably more conscious now of what I leave visible on a bench or a bag, my name tag turned inward, my keys kept in a zipped pocket rather than left loose, small habits I never once thought necessary before, that I now simply do without thinking, the way you eventually do with any safety habit that becomes routine enough. If you spend time in any shared public space regularly, a gym, a co-working space, any environment where you let your guard down simply because the space itself has rules and membership requirements, I want you to take one specific thing from what happened to me. Membership and access requirements filter for very little beyond a person's ability to pay a fee or sign a waiver. They do not filter for intent, and they should not be treated as a reliable proxy for safety on their own. Pay attention to anyone whose presence in a shared space follows a consistent pattern without a consistent visible purpose. Someone always there, never quite doing the thing the space is designed for. And be mindful of what personal information you leave incidentally visible in any public space, however trusted it feels. A name tag, a set of keys, a combination lock entered without a second thought about who might be nearby, watching. I trusted that locker room completely for almost 2 years before I had any reason not to. I do not think that trust was foolish exactly. I think it simply was never as fully earned as the space's rules and requirements made it feel. That gap between the safety a space implies and the safety it actually guarantees is worth remembering the next time you let your guard down somewhere simply because everyone around you is supposed to belong there too. I think often about how easily this could have continued indefinitely if my own front window hadn't happened to break that particular morning, if Curtis hadn't happened to mention another burglary in an offhand phone call, if I hadn't happened to forget my earbuds in my car on the one morning that let me see, from an angle I never normally used, exactly what that stillness in the corner had actually been concealing. None of the pieces that ultimately exposed him were the result of anyone's deliberate vigilance. They were accidents, small and unremarkable, that happened to align in a way that finally made an invisible pattern visible. That specific realization has stayed with me longer than almost anything else about the entire experience. The understanding that I did not catch him through any particular cleverness or caution of my own, but through sheer, undeserved luck, the kind of luck that 4 other households on his list apparently did not receive before the pattern finally broke open. I do not know how to fully reconcile that. I only know that I no longer assume a shared space is safe simply because I have used it without incident for a long time, and I no longer assume stillness, however unremarkable it looks, is always exactly what it appears to be.
Pay attention to your own gym, your own shared spaces, the small routines you've stopped consciously examining simply because nothing has ever gone wrong in them yet. Nothing going wrong yet is not the same thing as nothing being wrong at all.